All right. Well, welcome everybody. A lot of people are thinking that the garden season is winding down and there's not much to do, but actually coming up, it will be time to plant garlic. Um, Many of you have probably maybe even ordered garlic from the Kansas City Community Gardens, and that's going to be available for pickup starting on Monday. So at this point, I don't think we have any left, but if you didn't order some and want to, you could call the office and tell them you'd like to be on a list in case there's some left over. And we can see how that goes. But anyhow, all right, so we're going to talk about garlic because garlic planting time is coming up soon. And we'll also be talking about onions, and onion time is next spring, but we might as well talk about it now because they're both related plants and there's a lot of similarities in growing them. And so they just seem like it's a good combination to have those together. A little bit of background on garlic. Its origin is the Middle East and Central Asia. Scientists are never exactly sure where it first came from, but it was that part of the world. And there's a lot of history associated with garlic. I mean, if you read about it, it was even in the ancient pyramids and the tombs of the pharaohs and things like that. Much of the world's production right now is coming from China, about 80%, and that is a lot of garlic. That's like 21 million tons. So that is a lot of garlic. So anyhow, in the United States, most of the garlic production happens in California. And we'll talk a little bit about that because there's different kinds of garlic, and California garlic's a little bit different than what we typically grow here. So a little bit about the botanical background of garlic. It's a member of the Amaryllis family, which may not mean a lot to you, but it's a group of bulbs. A lot of the Amaryllis are ornamental flowers, but the actual genus is Allium, and you'll hear about other alliums. We'll talk about some of them. Typically, we talk about that as being the onion group. So there's lots of onion relatives in that group of alliums. And this particular species is called Allium sativum. And that doesn't mean a lot other than, sometimes people like to know a little bit of that background. Technically, it's actually a perennial, which means it would just continue to grow on its own. But we grow it as an annual because we plant it and then let it grow, and then the next spring it grows, and then we pick it, and we don't just leave it in the ground. So we grow it as an annual. But if you just left it in the ground, it would continue to grow on its own and just stay there, but it wouldn't be as good for eating because the cloves would multiply and they'd be smaller and it would become more crowded. So that's why we pick it, and because we want to keep that cycle of big clove production going on. Garlic you can tell it different from an onion because it has thin, flat leaves, as opposed to onion leaves are a little more rounded in the cross section if you look at a cross section of the leaf. But it does produce an underground storage structure, a bulb. Here you can see a drawing of a bulb, and most of you are familiar with what garlic bulb looks like. So a little different than an onion bulb because it divides into sections, which we call cloves. So that's what the onion bulb looks like. Here's some actual photographs. Sometimes it's helpful to see a photograph. So in the upper left-hand corner, we have a garlic bulb, same below. And you can see in the one below, you can see a little bit of the roots on the bottom. And you can see up here at the top, that's where the stalk came out, it was clipped off. But also, if you look in here, you can see the papery, thin stuff, but inside you can see the cloves, and you can actually see the individual cloves, like little bumps going around there. And so when you separate that apart, you get the individual cloves, because that's what you're going to be planting. And that's typically what you're going to, when you eat garlic, you break it into cloves. You just don't, drop the whole bulb into your soup or whatever, you break it up into cloves, and then typically you chop those up. But here's the garlic clove, and lots of times people have a hard time figuring out which is the top and which is the bottom, but it's fairly easy. is on the bottom, you'll usually see a little bit of the roots down here. You can't see that in this picture, but there'll be a little bit of dried root. But also it's the bigger and flatter side is the bottom. And then up at the top, it's kind of a little pointier, and because that's where the shoot will emerge, in the springtime. And so that's, you're going to plant it that way. But anyhow, we'll talk more about planting here in a little bit. Let's talk about some related plants to garlic, some relatives, other members of this allium group. Of course, onions. Here on the left side, you're very familiar with that. Another garlic relative is leek. And not everybody's as familiar with leeks, but they are becoming more common, very popular among cooks and chefs. Leeks have very fine flavor. Leeks are kind of different. They're actually more like instead of a bulb, they make a stalk, and it's sort of like a giant green onion stalk. And they can be actually quite large. You'll see them at the grocery store. They're pretty good size. And I'll just tell you, we're not in prime leek growing area because we don't have long enough cool season. But you can grow leeks here, and you can get nice ones. They just probably won't be quite as big as the ones at the store. Another relative is shallot, or shallots, sometimes people say, and you'll see these at the grocery store. These are another favorite of cooks and chefs. They have a very fine flavor. Some people think they're better than onions. I don't know if they're that much better, but maybe. It's hard to tell. But they are very good. They form little sections too, kind of like garlic, but not as many. It's more like a bulb divided into 2 or 3 different sections, as opposed to a bunch of individual little cloves. And they don't typically get as large as a regular onion. And then over on the right here, you see something called elephant garlic, which technically is not a true garlic. In fact, some of the literature references say it's more closely related to leek. But in any case, it's another allium, but it does look like a garlic, and it has a garlic flavor. It's much larger than a regular garlic bulb, and you don't even see it a lot. They're kind of pricey. You'll see them at farmers markets. You can order them online. Occasionally, you'll see them in the grocery store. They're very large. Sometimes they'll serve them at restaurants. And what they'll do is they'll actually roast the whole bulb, and then they'll, serve it like with crackers, and you can scoop out the insides of it and spread it on crackers. Kind of a trendy thing to do is roast whole bulbs of elephant garlic. The flavor is not quite as strong as regular garlic, traditional garlic. It's a little bit milder, but that's, some people like that. So something worth looking at sometime if you're interested. And then, of course, chives and garlic chives are also allium relatives of garlic. Most people are familiar with chives. They have kind of an onion flavor. They also have, the purple flowers. People add the cut up chives, usually basically like green onion, add it to different dishes. And then not as many people are familiar with garlic chives. That's the one on the right here with the white flowers, and it has flat leaf. So you can tell that different from the round leaf of the onion chives. And it does have a garlic flavor, and still you use the stalk. It doesn't really have much of a bulb, and it's a perennial. Both of these are perennials. They come up every year, and are just useful in cooking and lots of recipes. And so if you haven't tried chives or garlic chives, I do recommend them. And then just a couple more here. One on the left is kind of a strange one. It's called Egyptian onion. Sometimes they call it walking onion. And it is an onion. It's we grow this in our children's garden, in the curiosity garden. It's kind of strange. It doesn't have a big bulb, not very useful bulb, but it grows green stalks. So you can use the young stalks as scallions. And then at the top, it has this cluster of little bulbs. It looks like it's going to be a flower, but actually forms a bunch of little bulbs like little onion sets. And you can break those apart and plant them and get more. And it's a perennial, just keep on going. The reason they call it walking onion is because these little heads of the little onion sets at the top eventually become heavy and they fall over, and they extend out from the outside of that plant, and then wherever they land, or touch the ground, they'll start to root, and a new cluster of onions will grow, and that will grow up. So it kind of keeps spreading and moving. And when I say spreading, it's not difficult to control. It's not like going to take over your yard or anything. It just kind of self-propagates. And so it is very interesting plant, especially if you're interested in just having green onions for a long season. And then on the right, you'll see ornamental alliums. They're flowers that are bulbs that are grown for the flowers. They do have kind of an onion scent, but they're not really considered good for eating. Technically, you could eat them. They're not poisonous or anything, but typically just grown for the flowers. And they have a short bloom time. There's some of them that are kind of large and spectacular, like the ones shown in the picture here. And people kind of like them. They're a curiosity. There's some smaller ones that are used more often as in the perennial flower garden. So these are all just different relatives. You'll hear about them, the alliums, of which garlic is the one we're going to be talking about first, and then later we'll be talking about regular bulb onions. It's important, if you're going to grow garlic, to understand the life cycle. It is a cool season vegetable. It does not like warm weather. It's got kind of a unique life cycle, at least for us in this part of the country, because you're going to plant it in the fall. And then you want it to stay dormant. It'll do some root growth in the fall, but the top will be dormant until spring if you don't plant it too soon. And it does need a cold period necessary for bulb development. And if you'll read some gardening books, it'll tell you to plant your garlic cloves very, very early in the spring. And that is true for the northern half of the country, especially the farther north you get, because it would not do well over the winter, and the winters would be too harsh. Our winters can be harsh, but garlic, especially the kind that we're going to recommend growing to you, can take very cold weather. And that cold period is actually necessary for it to develop into a full-size bulb, because you're just planting a single clove. And if you wait too long and you plant that single clove in the spring, and there's not enough cold time to make it do its thing, when it's time to harvest, you're just going to harvest it. It's just going to be a single clove. It won't have divided itself. When you plant this in the fall, that cold period triggers the bulb to divide, and then once it starts to grow, you have, instead of just one clove, you have the whole round set of all the different cloves. So that's why it's so important to plant in the fall. And then, it sits dormant over the spring, although it did make some root growth. And so think of it kind of like tulip bulbs. People plant tulip bulbs and daffodil bulbs in the fall, and that's so they can get their cold period, and so the roots can get established. And then the next spring, the flowers come up. So this is very similar. In the spring, the bulbs will sprout, and a vegetative stalk will grow out of it, green leaves. And then the goal is to grow as big of a garlic plant as you can, because that will produce a bigger bulb. If your growing conditions aren't very good, maybe it's too dry, or it's not getting enough fertilizer, or the soil's not very good, the plant may not grow as big, and the bulb won't get as big. So you'll still get a bulb, it just won't be as big. So you're trying to get a big bulb with big cloves so you can have lots of garlic to eat. So, and then as it's growing green, it's going to start forming that bulb as the day length increases. Right now the days are getting shorter. Once we get past next March, the days will start getting longer. Or actually, yeah, the days will start getting longer. And at a certain day length, at a certain point in that time schedule, the bulbing is triggered, assuming that it's had sufficient exposure to the cold temperatures. If you just waited and planted it in spring, it wouldn't do this, but you planted it in fall, and at a certain day length, it will trigger, and that bulb will start getting bigger. And the bulbs will increase in size until they get mature, and then the green tops, the leaves, will start to die back, which means they'll start to yellow and eventually brown. and dry up, just like onion tops do. And lots of times people worry about this. They think something's wrong with their garlic. They think it's sick or dying. But no, this is part of the natural life cycle. And typically this is going to be happening in June. So, you know, like in late March, early April, it'll be sprouting. The plant will be getting bigger, you know, April and May, and it'll be a big green plant. And then sometime in June, early June probably, the stalks will start to yellow and brown and look like they're dying. And that's the normal life cycle. So you can see in this picture, this garlic is harvested here, and it's got, you know, starting to yellow. You see some browning, but look at these nice big bulbs that have been produced. So that's a good sign. So then once it's the right time, we'll talk a little bit about exact timing here in a little bit, but once the bulbs are harvested, then you kind of shake the dirt off of them. You don't want to wash them off, and you don't break them apart, the cloves, just leave them whole, just kind of brush the dirt off, and we'll talk more about harvesting here in a little bit. All right, now let's talk about different types of garlic. You know, we talked about some of those relatives. We'll talk about them a little bit. But the true garlics, there's break down into two categories, what we call a hard neck, which is sometimes called stiff neck garlic, and then there is the soft neck garlic. And those are the main two types of true garlic. And then the other garlics we mentioned, the elephant garlic, talked a little bit about that. And then we there's also wild garlic. Sometimes you'll be, you know, in the pastures, in the meadows, or, you know, even in your yard, or near the edge of woods. Sometimes you'll see wild garlic growing, and you'll see wild onions too sometimes, but definitely there's a garlic flavor. There's not a big bulb on wild garlic, but definitely has a green stalk and, you know, a little bit of wild bulb that you can use. And then of course the garlic chives that we mentioned also. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the two different kinds of true garlic, the soft neck and the hard neck. The soft neck does not produce a seed stalk, which is what we call a scape. And we'll talk about that a little bit more with the hard neck. But typically when you go to the grocery store, you're going to find soft neck garlic. And it's not quite as hardy here. As I mentioned, most of it's grown in California. That's because it doesn't take our hard winters as well. You can grow it here. It does have smaller cloves, harder to peel, and it has an outer circle of cloves on the bulb, and then it has an inner circle of cloves, which are much smaller. Some people think it stores longer than the hard neck, and that may be true. I don't know if it's significant. It's certainly not the main reason to grow this. It's cheaper to buy. Hard neck garlic will cost more money. It can be braided easily. You know, if you're trying to do the decorative braiding of garlic, you know, to hang it up. But again, that's not the main reason just to grow this garlic, this soft neck. And if you want to, you can braid hard neck garlic too. It's just not as easy. Doesn't work as well. So, you know, they'll typically, lots of times books will say you can't braid hard neck garlic, but people do it and it can be done. The hard neck garlic, which is the one we're going to talk the most about, and I would recommend to you, sometimes called stiff neck. And the reason they call that is because it produces this seed stalk in the center called a scape. And that's not like escape, it's a scape. It's a scape, and it's this stalk. If you look at this picture of the bulb here, you can see this dried up scape stalk that's in the center. And so around it are the big cloves. It's not an inner circle of cloves, just the big ones around it. Sometimes at the top of the scape, it will form little tiny miniature bulbs. They takes them a long time to get full size. Sometimes people let those grow and propagate from that. Kind of like those Egyptian onions that have the little onion sets at the top. It'll do that. It's definitely more cold hardy than the soft neck. So it has larger cloves, larger bulbs, and fewer number of cloves per bulb, which is a good thing. Because you want not very many cloves and big cloves. Usually that number is going to be somewhere between 4 and 12 And usually it's somewhere in between like 6 or 7 or something like that. The larger cloves are just so much easier to peel, easier to cook with. You can get that skin off the clove much easier, and they're just, easier to chop up. And I think the flavor is better. Um, a lot of people can't notice the difference, and even in the different varieties, some people say, "Oh, there's all these, heirloom varieties of hardneck garlic," and they're great. I like them all. And then again, it doesn't braid easily, so it's a different in that way. Here's a picture of the scape, in case you get a sense of it. Instead of a leaf in the center, this thing comes up. It's kind of like a curlicue. It's thicker and hard, and at the end is this little group of flowers that turns into those little bulbs. And so right now, a lot of people are excited about garlic scapes because they are edible, and use them to make, like you use a green onion, you can chop it up and use it in recipes and get a great garlic flavor. People even make pesto sauce using garlic scapes. So there's lots of different things you can do with them. Here you can see, while they're a little more advanced, it's turning into like a flower head, and there's like little bulbs forming underneath there. So that's what happens. But you are going to ideally want to remove this garlic scape, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Here's a picture of the cross section of the soft neck versus the hard neck. So the hard neck, again, you see bigger cloves. There's only one row of them around, and there's that scape in the middle, the dried scape. This has just been sliced open so you can see it. And here you see the soft neck. There's no scape in the center, and all the cloves are smaller. There's some on the inside, some on the outside. So more cloves, but smaller. So that's one of the reasons why I prefer definitely picking the hard neck, but also just because it's hardy, winter hardy, and grows much better here. All right, as far as culinary uses, garlic is legendary. It's interesting that it appears in many international cuisines. Garlic's all over the world. Most people have figured out garlic is good stuff. It makes food taste better. It adds wonderful flavor. So Italy, Italian food, French food, Middle Eastern food, Central European food, Greek food, Asian food, Indian food, North African, parts of South and Central America, all these different cuisines use garlic in different ways. So people rarely just eat garlic alone. It's not like you're gonna just have a side dish of just garlic, although sometimes people do that with that elephant garlic. But more often it's used as a condiment or an ingredient to flavor foods, to add flavor to recipes. And of course, many recipes call for garlic. And lots of times they'll say 1 clove or 2 cloves, but that's always kind of a personal taste. You may find a recipe that asks for 1 clove, that's not enough. And you may decide you want to put 2 cloves in or 3 cloves. So certainly can change recipes like that. And pretty much almost any kind of savory recipe, whether it's scrambled eggs or casserole, chili, whatever, you can add garlic to it if you like the flavor, and it will enhance the flavor for you. There's also some medical uses or medicinal uses of garlic. People have been using it, medicinally for many years. There's some historical records of way back, 6 BC, so a couple thousand years ago in India, using garlic as medicine. And there's lots of herbal recipes, home remedies. You can read a lot about it on the internet. It does have some antibiotic properties, also some antibacterial properties, some antifungal properties. There is some information to suggest that it may play a role in preventing certain kinds of cancer. It's certainly not considered, just a cure for cancer or anything like that. But, lots of foods that we eat, things like broccoli and cabbage, they play a role in helping to prevent different cancers. So, things that are healthy and have lots of interesting phytonutrients in them definitely can do things like that. It also may help to lower blood pressure, there's conflicting evidence on that. Some studies have shown it does, other ones show it doesn't. You know what? It certainly can't hurt. Eating lots of garlic is likely to help you to be healthier. I'm going to recommend it to you. And, you know, at some point they may find out more about what it can do and what it can't do. But for right now, I'm just telling you, besides tasting good, it's probably got some health benefits. As far as planting garlic, soil requirements, you want well-drained, deep soil, you know, just good garden soil. You don't want it to stay soggy. High level of organic matter is good, just like, you know, any other garden, but garlic especially seems to appreciate it. Soil pH refers to how acid the soil is. Soil pH of 6 to 7. Remember, 7 is neutral, 6 is a little on the acid side. And so that's the ideal. Lots of our soils around here are a little bit higher than 7, but garlic still seems to grow pretty well. But that's, you know, if you're looking for ideal conditions, you want to get your pH in that 6 to 7 range. And of course, loose soil, and that's what you get when you get lots of organic matter, you get looser soil as opposed to tight clays that pack really hard. Clay is not good, doesn't allow for the bulb expansion, but also it just stays too moist and doesn't drain well. So just good garden soil, doesn't need to be anything magical, with some organic matter added to it. Again, planting, when to plant. You're going to plant in fall, not spring. I can't emphasize this enough. And there's some different theories on when to plant. Some people say, oh, just start planting it in September or October. The thing is, if you plant in September or early October, it may sprout on you. And typically, it won't kill the plant, but it's going to use up some of the energy that's stored in that bulb, because it'll have to go dormant again, and then it'll have to sprout again next spring. So we like to plant a little bit later. So I say that window, that target window is, you know, like November 15th to December 15th. And you can plant a little bit later. We've actually had some good luck planting in January, but, you know, in January, the weather gets, you know, kind of tricky. Sometimes you get snow. The ground could be frozen. So we like kind of that November 15th to December 15th. There was a man who worked for us years ago named John Williams, who actually taught me how to grow garlic and how to grow onions. He learned a lot about it and just knew how to grow them both very well. And what he liked to do is say that you plant garlic on the shortest day of the year, which would be December 21st, and then you're going to harvest it on the longest day of the year, which is about June 21st. You know, the times when the equinox or whatever, you know, fall equinox and spring equinox. So anyhow, so that's what he recommended. I like to go a little bit earlier because, you know, sometimes it rains a lot. Ideally you'd be planting it when the ground is dry, and it certainly is dry right now. But right now, if you pick up your garlic, I would not recommend planting it yet, because it might sprout on you. It looks like we're going to still have some warm weather, and you don't want to get it sprouting. If it does sprout, it's not the end of the world, but it just won't make for as strong of a plant. And then here's just general guidelines. You know, plant in soil that you haven't had garlic or onions for the previous 3 years. That's just part of rotating your crops. You know, there's some diseases and insects that collect with the different families and the onion family, you know. So you definitely want full sun. They won't do well in shade. You want to plant the larger cloves. Large cloves will produce bigger bulbs, you know, but if you want to plant them all, sure, you might get some slightly smaller bulbs. If you're planting the soft nut garlic, only plant the outside circle ones, because those tend to be the larger ones. And then, as we said before, plant the tips up and the roots down. You know, the planting depth, you're going to want to have it be about 2 inches deep, and that's from the bottom of the soil here. So you're going to want to have 2 inches of soil on top of this. And then as far as distance, 4 to 6 inches apart in raised beds seems to be sufficient. Especially if you're a good gardener, you could probably go more towards the 4. If you're a little bit less experienced, I would go with the 6. Or if you're just planting rows in your garden, rather than planting a single row, I usually recommend planting at least a double row, about 15, 24 inches apart, what they recommend. That just gives you a chance to get in there and do some hoeing, but it doesn't have to be that wide. And then, of course, I actually recommend watering at planting time because that will start the roots to grow. And you want the roots to grow and get established. Not that the top will grow, you don't want that to have happen, but again, you want to have the roots start to grow. And if it's dry, like it is right now, the roots won't start growing until they get a little bit of water. And then overwintering, remember these plants are going to be alive over the winter, their roots will be growing. If we get really dry winter, you would want to water. And that seems kind of strange to go out and water something that you can't see and it doesn't have green leaves on it, but you want that bulb to get occasional watering. So you can feel down in there, if it feels dry, go ahead and water. And then the other thing we like to do is apply some mulch, some straw mulch, but wait till after we get a hard freeze. Somewhere after, like maybe 22 degrees, if it doesn't look like it's going to be warm again for a while. Put, like 3 to 4 inches of straw mulch and then moisten that a little bit so it doesn't blow away. And that mulch will help the temperatures from fluctuating, because lots of times over the winter we'll get warm weather, we'll get cold weather, then real warm, then real cold. And if you get the spell of warm weather, it might start to sprout. And having the mulch will help insulate that soil and help it stay cool down below. Also will just help keep it moist, so you probably have to do less watering. And also can just prevent what we call frost heaving. If you have a freeze and then a thaw and a freeze and a thaw, sometimes it pushes bulbs out of the ground a little bit. So then in the spring, you're going to want to fertilize a little bit. Nitrogen is important for big, healthy plants. Straw mulch, if it's blown away, might add a little more mulch. Remember to cut those scapes off once they start to grow. And then once during the growing season, about 1 inch per week is enough, usually, if we don't get rain. There's not a lot of bug problems. Usually not a lot of disease problems. The bulbs can get some fungus diseases if you have a heavy, wet soil. But we've already said try and avoid heavy, wet soils. Garlic does really well in raised beds. You have better drainage. And of course, having added organic matter to it, that's good. There is one disease that's fungus disease called white rot disease. It's a fungus that can stay in the soil, and that's another reason why, if you've ever had a problem with that, you would want to move your garlic to a different place each year so you wouldn't be trying to grow in that same spot. But I have not seen the white rot disease. It's just something that's been mentioned in the literature, and it can happen, especially in soils that stay too wet. There's many ideas about how to fertilize garlic. Probably none of them, as long as you follow instructions, are going to, you won't go wrong. But nitrogen is the most important thing for garlic. We don't have a lot of that in our soils. It fluctuates quite a bit. If you'll look at your fertilizer bottles, there's a formula on it, like this one here is called 511. And that means it's 5% nitrogen. The first number is nitrogen. So it's better to do several lighter applications rather than just dumping a whole bunch on at once and doing it once. And liquid fertilizers work great. You can mix something up in a watering can and then water with it. And then once you reach a certain point, after you've got like 4, full-size leaves on the plant have formed, then they say you don't need to fertilize after that. We also have a chicken manure fertilizer we use. Use about 1.5 pounds or 3 cups in one raised bed, just to give you an idea of approximate. That's a dry fertilizer. You just kind of work it in with the soil. It has some nitrogen in it. It's a slow release. So lots of different ways to fertilize. And then harvesting garlic, that would be in June. If you want to, if you're really hungry for garlic, you can pull some a little bit earlier. It just maybe won't keep as long. The other thing is you don't want to wait too long to harvest. If you just leave it in the ground and let the plants completely die and turn brown and dry up, you might not be able to tell where the plants are. But also, if you wait too long, the bulbs will start to separate in the ground because that plant is trying to divide itself and spread out. and then they won't keep as long. So, you know, you look in June, once the leaves start yellowing and browning, start pulling them up because they aren't going to be getting any larger at that point. Like they say, like when 1/3 of the leaves are yellowing, you can look and pull one out, see if the cloves are formed pretty well. And, you know, they'll be segmented, they'll have tight outer skin on them. And if you wait too long, again, those bulbs will split apart. I also don't recommend harvesting when the soil is really muddy, just because you're going to have mud all over your bulbs, and it's harder to, you know, get them clean because you're not supposed to wash them a lot. So I wait for the ground to be dry. You know, don't do it right after a rain. It doesn't have to be super dry, just not muddy. So, and generally you're not like having to dig these, not like potatoes or sweet potatoes. They are underground, more so than onions, but generally just grab that stalk and pull it out and it'll come right out. Here you can see on the left some garlic that was harvested a little too mature, and see how the paper has split open and it's starting to break apart. And so those garlic cloves will not keep as well, but they're certainly edible, and you know, will keep for quite a while. But if you want to keep the longest, you want to keep them intact. So here's some that are harvested at the proper maturity. You can see and feel the cloves in there, but they haven't split open apart yet. And then when you harvest, you want to trim the top. You know, I mean, you can try and do the braiding thing if you want. The problem with the braiding thing is it actually does take a little bit of energy out of the bulb because it's trying to send moisture up to those leaves from the bulb. So I like to trim them off about 1 inch from the top. Just clip them off with the clippers. Don't peel the skin, don't wash them. And then the roots, you want to trim the roots off to about 1/4 inch like that. And that'll just help the bulb to dry and store nicely. It stores pretty good at room temperature for several months. If you can, put them in a mesh bag like this. Never want to use a plastic bag. Mesh bags work really well. Sometimes, you know, I'll just put it in a cardboard lid or a shallow cardboard box just so they're not touching each other. But, you know, a well ventilated room, you know, protect from moisture, you know, 60 to 65 degrees is good. That's a little cool, but it's good for garlic. Doesn't need to be refrigerated. When you do initially harvest them, they like to do what they call curing it, which just means drying it properly so that it will store better. And if you can have it be a little warmer with low humidity, you know, for 2 to 4 weeks, kind of like what you do with sweet potatoes, it does make that skin dry nicely and cure, and the bulb is in good shape for lasting a long time. If you can't do, you know, 75 or 80 degrees, 70 degrees is fine. Just the main thing is indoors where it's warm and dry. So that's storing garlic. And then, of course, using garlic, you know, you peel the dry skin off, chop it, saute it, whatever. You can roast it and use it as a spread. You can use a garlic press if you want to press it out. If you've ever used garlic powder, all that is garlic that has been dried and ground. Obviously not as good as fresh garlic, but you know, still can be an acceptable substitute if you don't have fresh garlic. But fresh garlic, of course, in its amazing smells as you're, you know, working in the kitchen. I always just love the smell of garlic and onions, and adds lots of good flavors. So lots of good ways to use garlic, lots of good recipes. And if you want to save your own garlic, you know, don't separate the cloves, keep it intact. You know, pick garlic at the proper stage. If some of the garlic starts to sprout, you know, over the winter, that you want to save the plant, you could go ahead and eat that, and you know, because it's not going to keep forever. Again, when you're going to plant your garlic, if you're saving your own plant, the biggest, healthiest cloves, typically a pound of garlic. You know, you're planting the cloves, it'll produce about 4 pounds, maybe 6 pounds of garlic if you're using hard neck. Again, with the soft neck, if you're saving your own cloves, don't save the small ones, just use them and plant only the larger cloves. If you're going to buy garlic, don't just buy garlic at the grocery store. It's probably going to be soft neck. and it could be very old. Sometimes store garlic has been used, treated with a chemical so that it won't sprout. You know, there's lots of mail order catalogs that have lots of different varieties, but they do sell out early. I would not be surprised if most of them are sold out already. I've seen that happen some already. We start taking garlic orders at community gardens pretty early. You can watch our website. So right now we're not taking orders. We're only going to be selling garlic to people who already, paid and ordered that. So if you do order from a catalog, it's probably going to be much more expensive than if you order it from the community gardens. We try not to market it too much and make it very affordable. And we have several different varieties of really good hard neck garlic. We have extra hardy white German garlic. We have music. And I think there's another one we might be trying for this year. So real quick, here's the common mistakes with garlic, just to kind of remind you. You don't want to plant it in the spring. You want to plant it in the fall. You don't want to plant it upside down. You don't want to plant it too early. And then if we have a dry winter or a dry spring, and if you don't water it, it won't do well. And the other thing is, if you let the weeds take over in the spring, garlic does not compete well with weeds. And then if you wait too long to harvest, then the garlic won't keep as long. So those are kind of the mistakes. So just the opposite will bring you success. If you plant at the right time, you plant the large cloves. I do recommend planting hardneck. You plant in a good, well-drained soil at the proper planting depth and spacing. Remember to mulch. Remember to fertilize. Remember to remove those seed stalks, the scapes. Give it an inch to an inch and a half of water, once they're growing in the spring, and keep the weeds down, and then harvest at the proper stage. And you do all those things, you will have success, and you will have wonderful garlic to enjoy and to maybe save your own garden. All right, so now we're going to talk about onions, and some of the things that apply to garlic will apply to onions, so this probably won't take quite as long, but got a little ways to go with our onions. Again, the background, origins in the Middle East, people, at least in the literature, recorded history, have been growing onions for 5,000 years. Onions have edible bulbs, but they also have edible leaves. China, India, the United States are the leading onion producers. Onions, like garlic, very versatile in cooking. You can bake them, you can boil them, you can braise them, you can grill them, you can fry them, you can roast them, you can saute them. Sometimes people will dry onions and make onion powder. You can pickle them, or you can eat them raw. So lots of different ways to eat onions. And I am a huge fan of onions, like I am a huge fan of garlic. Again, they're a member of the same family. A little bit different in that most onions typically aren't perennial, they're biennials. They throw up a seed stalk, a flower stalk during the second year, and then the plant typically dies after that, or spreads out anyhow. It does produce the underground storage structure, which plant stores energy in the bulb, just like garlic. It's a cool season vegetable. And again, the bulbs will form under favorable conditions, which mean the proper day length and proper temperatures. And just so you know, an onion bulb is 89% water. So that will let you know right away that it's going to make sure you need to water it enough. So that's one of the important things is watering. We'll talk about that in a little bit. In fact, right here, the keys to success with onions. I'm giving you this right at the beginning, so you'll be able to pay attention to what you need to know. You want to start with plants, and we'll talk about that here in a minute, as opposed to seeds or little tiny onion bulbs. It's important to pick good varieties. Some varieties do better around here than others. Planting at the right time, the proper depth. Again, you want a good soil, high in organic matter, just a good basic garden soil. It's going to take some nitrogen fertilizer, lots of water, especially as you get later into the season of spring. Of course, weed control, and then proper storage. All right, so lots of times you'll go to the garden center in the spring and there's packets of onion seeds that look like this. And there's little tiny bulbs that you can buy in a bag. Those are called onion sets. And then there's little bundles of green plants, little green onion plants like this, which are seedlings. And so the question is, which one is the best way to go? Right away, I'll tell you the onion seeds generally are not the easiest. They just need a longer season. Just like, you know, you don't typically just plant a tomato seed in your garden. You start with a little plant. If you just plant a seed for onion, it won't have time to make a big onion bulb, at least in our part of the country. The onion sets here on the left, you can grow them for green onions, scallions, or you can let them grow to grow bulbs. But typically, the onion sets do not grow as big a bulb as if you plant the plants over here on the right. They just aren't the right varieties, the right day length varieties. And if you're a really good gardener, you can grow some pretty good sized bulbs. If you plant them at the right time, water them a lot, fertilize them, you get some pretty good sized bulbs, but you'll have better success, likelihood of success, getting a big onion bulb if you plant these little seedlings, a little bundle of green onion plants over here. So I typically just recommend the little onion sets, the little bulbs, just for growing green onions. And what I like to do with those is spread them out over the season so you have green onions growing all the time. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But for getting the biggest bulbs, the easiest, I recommend buying the seedlings or plants. And we sell those at Kansas City Community Gardens. Okay, so here, just what I was talking about, you can grow onions either for the green onions, the stalks, or you can let them produce a bulb. Or scallions, that's the other name for that. Green onions do not store well, but they're very fresh, high in vitamin C, have lots of great flavor. The bulbs here, they store well. They don't have as much vitamin C because there's not green plant involved. We're eating the white part there. But still very good, very tasty, and of course they both have their places. Onion varieties, there's lots of different kinds. We don't have quite as many choices as some places. There's sweetness. Some onions are sweeter than others. A lot of people like the really sweet onions, like the Vidalia onions. There's other varieties, Walla Wallas. Typically, the sweet onions do not keep as long. They don't have as much sulfur in them, which makes them not sweet. And so they don't keep as long. For culinary uses, typically there's 3 different colors. There's the red onions, the yellow onions, and the white onions. And just so you'll know, they have different storage lengths. Typically, the yellow onions will keep longest, although not always true. Sometimes the white, depends on the variety. But for sure, the red ones do not keep as long. And that's why typically red onions are more expensive in the store. They don't keep as long. They sprout quicker in your kitchen, So in some cases, maybe red onions are not quite as useful if you're trying to store onions for a long time. But as far as choosing the right onion variety, again, we talked about that day length, because at a certain day length, the green plant stops growing so much and it starts growing that bulb. And so if that happens too soon, your bulb won't be big. I'm sorry, if it happens too soon, the onion won't be very big. If it happens too late, the onion won't be very big. So you want to get the right size onion. So you can see here, there's different varieties for short day, like the Vidalia onions grow good down in the south, the deep south, Texas, Florida, Georgia, etc. And then in the middle are intermediate day length onions, and then up above here are longer day onions. So up till now, when you bought onion seedlings, they would typically be either the long day or the short day. There weren't really good intermediate day varieties. But you can look right here where we are here in Kansas City. We're in this green area, that's the intermediate. So the best onion varieties are going to be for intermediate day length. And we have 3 varieties that are intermediate day. They're also called day neutral, meaning that you can pretty much grow them in the north, the south, or in the central. But they actually grow well here in the middle where we are. So the one that I recommend the most for beginning growers is a variety we have called Superstar. It just seems to be the easiest one. If you haven't had experience getting big onion bulbs, it's the easiest one to get big bulbs. It's the only white onion variety that was selected to win the special All-America Award, which is a very prestigious award, which means it's easy to grow all over the country. It has moderate sweetness. It's definitely not considered a sweet onion. Has a moderate storage life, 3 to 5 months. I've actually had some go longer, so it just depends. So, not short storage, but, moderate. Another variety we have is called Candy. It's a yellow onion, has large bulbs. I don't think it's quite as easy to grow, but, pretty close to the Superstar for getting a big bulb. It's another day neutral variety, so it has that intermediate day length, a moderate sweet flavor. It's called Candy, but it's not super sweet like a Vidalia. It does have a longer storage life, a bit longer, 5 months and longer. Has strong roots. It's disease resistant, so it's a good variety. And then there's another one we have. It's a red one, red candy apple. It's also a day neutral, intermediate day length type onion, moderate storage life. They say 2 to 3 months. Could go a little longer. This is a little bit sweeter. Red onions typically are a little bit sweeter. Medium large, good red color. Slice it, very beautiful. So if you like a red onion, I recommend. Right. So these 3 varieties are the top varieties for our part of the country. Again, you can try. Some people actually have good luck with like the Walla Walla or the Vidalia. So it can work. But the best chance for success to get large onions would be to do these 3 varieties, and particularly I think the Superstar is the easiest. As far as timing, when you're going to plant, usually it's like February for green onions, for scallions, anytime from February through October. And you can plant those little bulbs every 2 weeks. I don't recommend planting the little seedlings just for green onions, just because it's kind of a waste. They're a little more expensive. The little bulbs are pretty cheap. But if you plant like every 2 weeks, you'll just have green onions, for a long season. And I used to think, oh, green onions are so cheap. But if you look at the grocery store prices now, they're getting more expensive, and it's actually worthwhile to grow your green onions. And they don't take up much room. They don't take very long. And because you're not trying to grow a bulb, you can plant them very close together. This here is maybe like 1.5 inches or so. You can put them like 1 inch or, even closer than that, 3/4 of an inch. Some people also have had some good luck planting them indoors, like in a sunny window. Get a little green stalk, over the winter. Obviously just we need to water them and give them some good sunshine. As far as for bulb onions, the timing is kind of specific. You have a very limited planting window, March 15th through April 7th. If you plant much before March 15th, lots of times the plants aren't available that early, but also we can get really hard freezes that are kind of rough for the plants. Even though they're pretty hardy, really, really hard freeze could damage some of your onion seedlings. So March 15th, April 7th, I kind of aim typically for that March 24th type time. Don't want to plant too much later than that. If the closer you get to that April 7th, the less size your onions will have to grow, so they won't get quite as large. The tops won't get quite as large, so the onion bulbs won't get quite as large. If you plant much past April 7th, you just won't get nearly as big onions. So I'm not saying you can't do it, it just won't be as productive. Some people have heard a little bit about overwintering onions. There's some special varieties, because normally if you plant an onion in the fall, it goes over the cold period. That's going to trigger it to flower early the next spring and not produce as big a bulb. But there are some special varieties that don't get triggered by overwintering and are cold hardy. Walla Walla is one of them. Some winters are a little harsh on it. Could be too tough. Another one, there was a wild back, there's a variety called Buffalo that could be overwintered. So The overwintering ones, you'd actually plant them like in August, little seedlings, and then actually put them out in your garden in early September. And you just have to order special varieties for overwintering. If you're interested in that, I would recommend Territorial Seed Company. It's in the Pacific Northwest. They do a lot of overwintering onions up there. But that would be a good source to look at for some overwintering onion seed. So again, the difference, green onions versus bulb onions. Green onions, you're going to start with sets. You're going to plant deep. You don't have to, can plant it, so the bulb's completely covered up. That'll give you longer stalk. The roots go down, the point goes up. You put them very close together. For bulb onions, you're going to start with plants, and you're going to plant them shallow, 4 to 6 inches apart. And when I say shallow, I usually tell people to plant them just deep enough so the plant doesn't fall over when you water it. If it falls over, just mound a little dirt around it. In fact, sometimes I'll do that anyhow. Mound a little bit of dirt around it, knowing that as the plant grows, that soil will get washed away eventually. Because when onions are grown properly and they're mature, you're not digging them. They are not buried. They might be half buried, but should be almost like 2/3 out of the ground. Sometimes almost all the way out of the ground like this. And that's onions being grown properly. Doing that allows the onions to expand properly. If they're buried too deep, the onions are more oval shaped and not as round. They don't get as large. So as far as care and maintenance for onions, very similar things to the garlic, although a little bit different. So mulching is important. That'll help keep the weeds down. It will help keep it moist. Fertilizer, getting that nitrogen fertilizer so you get a nice, big, strong, healthy onion plant. I mean, look at this plant right here. See how thick the stalk is, and lots of good leaves and sturdy, upright. That's a very healthy plant. And it made a really nice, healthy onion bulb. This plant over here was a little smaller. So, maybe the seedling was a little smaller. This bulb didn't get big. It's still a nice onion. Of course, watering, especially when you get into, April, May, early June, watering is important because it's a little bit drier in May than it is in April. And then, pest control, there is an insect problem. It's called thrips, THRIPS. It's a little tiny insect that likes to feed on onion leaves. So typically it's not going to bother your bulb, so don't worry about it too much. But if you leave your green onion for a long time, it will affect the green onion leaves. Normally you don't leave green onion leaves for that long. So it's usually not a big problem. And then pulling the soil off the shoulders. Once that bulb starts expanding, if this is still buried in the dirt, halfway or most of the way, you can use like a watering hose to kind of gently wash the soil a little bit away from the side there, from the bulb, or just pull it away. And that will allow that bulb to expand and be round and large. So if you don't do that again, the bulb won't be quite as large and it will be a little bit different shape. The problems, so here I mentioned thrips. Here you can see what the damage looks like on green onion stalk. See how that kind of white flecking in the leaves there? That's caused by thrips. And those are kind of like little aphid type creatures, not the same as aphids, but basically they have sucking mouth parts and they're sucking the plant sap from that leaf and that weakens it. So again, it's not going to hurt your bulb. The longer the onions are around, the more you'll see that. You usually don't see it too much on the green onion stalks, so you can eat them. But typically you would not be eating this stalk that's been around for a while, and there could be thrips on that stalk. Obviously, well, there are thrips on that stalk. So you can use neem oil. It's an organic pesticide to control thrips if you get bad buildups of that pest. Again, moving your onion bed around to different places each year is helpful. So you're, rotating your crops. And then, again, sometimes there's some diseases that cause the bulbs to rot prematurely. That's usually caused by poor drainage and too much moisture, but don't see that very often. And again, also the closer you get to the harvesting time, the more you can cut back on the watering. so that the bulbs will start to dry naturally. As far as harvesting timing, it's going to be in June, but if you want to pick some early, what you'll start to see happening is sometimes they start yellowing, but sometimes the stalks just start falling over like that. And this is natural. People worry about it. They think something's wrong with my onion, the stalks are falling over. Generally, that means it's time. The plant is wanting to kind of break that stalk to stop the growing and just so that the bulb can go dry. And so then when you harvest it, the bulb is fully expanded. You can pull it by hand. It's pretty easy to do. Some people will leave their onions out in the garden to dry, but sometimes the temperatures and the sunshine is really strong in June. And what I've seen happen sometimes on onions that I've left out is they will get sunburned. And it'll just be on the one side, maybe it's the west side, where the afternoon sun is shining on those bulbs. And it can literally make a little burn spot. It'll be brown and it'll make that onion likely to rot, and not keep as long. So you don't want to leave the onions tops on, again, because moisture is going to move out of that bulb into those leaves, trying to keep them alive. So you trim them off like 1 inch, and you're going to trim the roots off short, like 1/4 inch, just like you did on your garlic. And then that bulb will dry and continue to dry and then be stored. So as far as storing onions, don't wash them, don't peel them. A cool, dry location. They don't need to be in the refrigerator. Ventilation is good. The storage length will depend on the temperatures and the variety. Probably variety is the biggest one. And what typically happens to onions that have been stored for a long time is they'll start to sprout. That plant's wanting to grow. So like look at this bulb down here, this red one. That's unusual. You see that in the store sometimes, or just onions that you bought at the store. So if you see that happen right away, you can use that onion typically. You only feel it if it's not soft. Usually at this stage, it's not. If you let it go very long, the onion will start to get soft and start to rot. And if you've never smelled a rotting onion, it's pretty bad. So you'll be able to know that something's going on right away. But an onion like this that's just starting to sprout, go ahead and cut it, use it for cooking. The other thing is there is a way to store onions for longer term. You can chop onions in the fall, or I'm sorry, in June when you harvest them, chop them up, and you can actually freeze them. Some people will actually saute them and then freeze them. So there's different ways you can do it, but it's pretty easy to do. Just put them in a freezer bag, chop them up whatever size you like, and you can freeze them. And they're useful in cooking and chili and all different kinds of recipes. So very, very useful. The ones that you're storing at your house, you can put them in mesh bags, or I put them on like a cardboard tray. I'll check them every now and then, just to feel them, see if they're staying hard, making sure they're not sprouting or turning soft. So it really is a good idea to check on them so that if some of them are starting to go, you can use those up first. And if the ones that aren't sprouting stay for longer, because they will keep longer. All right, so that is the conclusion of our workshop. I'm going to check with Rob and see if we have any questions that people have.
Yeah, it looks like we have 3 questions, and I just emailed them to you.
Okay, great. All right, let me pull those questions up. All right, so first one is about watering from December through March. It says 1 inch per month. Is that good enough, assuming you might get some very light snow? That's definitely good enough. In fact, I probably maybe wasn't clear enough. The 1 inch, you probably won't need to do that, because normally we do have rain. And I'm convinced we will have rain again. I know it's been very dry summer. We're going to start getting rains, and you don't need really deep rains, for your garlic bulb. So And then if you water once and then eventually you'll be mulching, that soil is not going to dry out quickly because A, you've got mulch, it's colder, and it's the soil, we tend to get more rain, over the winter and snow. So I'm thinking there's a good chance you won't need to water your garlic bulbs at all during the winter. So just don't do that automatically because you don't want them to stay too wet. But if we're having like 3 or 4 weeks and there's no rain or snow whatsoever, then I would give them a little bit of water, so that they will not dry out, so the roots will stay moist and everything. That 1 inch is really more for like once the plants start to grow in springtime. If we're not getting enough rain, you want to give that 1 inch of water. So that's why I like to have a rain gauge in the spring out. And then, if you get just like a 1/4 inch of rain, that's not enough, so you want to give it a little more so you get up to that 1 inch. So don't worry as much about watering over the winter unless we're getting absolutely no rain or snow. Yeah, the second question was, when should we stop fertilizing? Again, that would be once you see the 4 leaves, once your leaf stalks have been growing up and you've got 4 leaves coming out, at that point you don't need to do any more fertilizing. There's enough nutrients there already, assuming you did some previously, because you just want not so much emphasis on trying to grow more leaves as you want the energy to go into making the bulb. And if you continue to fertilize after that point, you'll get more leaf stock, more green growth, but less bulb size at that point. So yeah, just once the plants are up, they look pretty good. You got 4 good healthy leaves on there, then you can stop fertilizing. And then the best time to get rid of chickweed. Chickweed, if you're not familiar, is a winter annual, and it spreads seeds, so it actually grows over the winter. Typically, you don't see it. Lots of times it's starting to sprout, in the fall, and just a little tiny plant stays dormant. But then starting, in March, you've got garlic planted, you can see chickweed coming up. One thing that will help with that is if you have mulch. If you have mulch, that will smother out chickweed and you won't have a big problem with it. But you can pull chickweed out anytime that it's big enough. Once you start seeing it, if you're not mulched, or you start seeing it, you can start pulling it. It's not going to be very deep rooted. You just don't want to be digging around with a hoe typically. So I would do weeding by hand, pull that chickweed out. Again, if you're mulching, you're not going to have near the problem with it. And once for several years, if you don't let chickweed grow in your garden, it's not going to be dropping seeds. So eventually you won't be having as much of a problem with it. But once it's big enough for you to pull, a couple inches, you can just, especially if the ground is moist, it's really easy to pull. And that way it won't be competing with your garlic or with your onions or lettuce or whatever else you're trying to grow. So that's probably the best time to get rid of chickweed. If anyone should have more questions, as always, you can email them to us, send them to contact@kccg.org. We're also happy to answer questions when you come in the spring, to pick up seeds and plants. If you haven't already, you can actually renew your membership. Our fiscal year starts October 1st. So right now we're in the new gardening year. It's time to start thinking about gardening for next year. So you can renew your membership. You can do that online. Make it easy on yourself. Don't have to make a special trip in. But if you're coming in to pick up your garlic, you certainly can renew your membership then. But it's always a good idea to try and renew your membership or sign up for your membership before next spring, because in the spring we get so busy, you just have to wait longer in line, and it will take longer. But anyhow, so again, thank you for joining us today. This will be available online. There's many other workshops available online, and we will be starting a serious, schedule of workshops. Watch for our website starting in January. And then, of course, our newsletter will come out, you know, at the end of January. But anyhow, we'll actually start some workshops probably in January. And so keep an eye on the website for that, and just, you know, watch some newsletters. And again, we appreciate everyone for supporting Kansas City Community Gardens, and we wish you the very best in this new year of gardening. So thank you, everybody.